My name is Elise. I don't remember the exact moment I stopped feeling like someone's wife and started feeling like someone's shadow. Maybe it was after Noah's promotion or the last night we slept side by side without turning away. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, no storm to mark the change. Just quiet, a silence that grew roots between us while the routines of life, laundry, dinner, early meetings kept us moving like polite strangers. We live in a modest house nestled in a peaceful neighborhood just outside Ashland. It's the kind of place where spring arrives like a secret, softly unfurling through rose bushes and the rustle of leaves. The grass stays green here even when everything else feels dull. Every afternoon, while Noah is buried in his endless stream of virtual meetings, I step outside into the garden. Not for the flowers, not for the fresh air, but for the silence I can claim as mine. There, with my knees in the dirt and the sun leaning low against my skin, I feel something I don't feel in the rest of my life. Presence. I press my palms into the earth and remember what it's like to be grounded. Not useful, not efficient, just here. I don't blame Noah. Not fully. Life gets loud. Work gets heavy. And somewhere in between, we forget to check in, not with each other, but with ourselves. Still, what hurt most wasn't the lack of affection. It was the slow, creeping sense of becoming invisible, of being reduced to function. A role, a routine. We still shared dinner, still moved around each other in the same space, still heard the familiar sound of water in the shower or the microwave beeping in the kitchen. But he no longer saw me. Not really, until someone else did. It began simply. One afternoon, as I was pruning the lavender, I looked up, and across the street, on the porch of the pale blue house that had recently been sold, stood a man I hadn't noticed before. He was holding a teapot, and he smiled, not flirtatiously, not awkwardly, just kindly, like a quiet hello spoken without words. His name, I would later learn, was Adrian. His name was Adrian. I didn't ask. I overheard it one evening as he greeted a delivery driver outside his home. Just the sound of it felt soft somehow, like it belonged in a slower world than mine. He had a quiet way of existing, calm posture, intentional movements, a presence that didn't demand space, but still held it with grace. Each day after that first moment, I noticed him more, watering his herbs, walking to the mailbox, sometimes just standing there, mug in hand, watching the sky change colors at dusk. We didn't speak at first, but when our eyes met across the low garden fence, he always nodded. A small gesture, but it stayed with me longer than it should have. One late afternoon, I was trimming the roses when he said something for the first time. "You take care of them beautifully." I'm still trying to figure out which ones are weeds and which ones deserve a second chance. I turned surprised. He wasn't smiling like someone trying to impress, just offering something light. "A bridge, maybe. Some weeds bloom too," I replied almost without thinking. He chuckled softly, still holding his watering can. "I'll remember that." And just like that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough to make me realize how long it had been since someone spoke to me like that, with presence, with patience, with no intention other than to connect for a moment. Noah used to talk that way, before everything became about efficiency and logistics. Now, our exchanges were mostly transactional. "What's for dinner? Did the package arrive? Can you check if we're out of milk?" But Adrian, he said almost nothing, and yet, somehow it felt like more than I had heard in months. I didn't go looking for him, but I found myself lingering longer near the fence, tending to plants that didn't really need pruning, waiting without admitting I was waiting. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't, but the anticipation of being seen, of being spoken to, had already taken root. One afternoon, I pricked my finger on a thorn. Just a small cut, enough to make me flinch and grab a paper towel from my apron pocket. Moments later, I heard footsteps, Adrian stood at the edge of my garden with a tiny first aid kit in hand. No grand gesture, just a quiet offer. If you don't mind. I didn't speak. I just held out my hand. He cleaned the wound carefully, like someone who had been taught to handle fragile things with reverence. His touch wasn't intimate, but it was aware, present, alive. He didn't ask how it happened, didn't ask why I seemed so still. He only said, "You should wear gloves." But when he pulled his hand away, mine didn't close right away. That evening, I made dinner as usual. Grilled salmon, steamed rice, a cucumber salad with dill and lemon. Noah ate quickly, his eyes never leaving the glow of his laptop screen. No comment about the food. No mention of the bandage still wrapped around my hand. No glance that lingered long enough to notice the soft pink in my cheeks that hadn't been there the day before. He didn't ask, and I didn't offer, but I smiled. Just slightly, not because of Adrian, but because I had remembered what it felt like to be noticed gently. I didn't see Adrian the next day, or the day after that, but I caught myself listening for the sound of his front door, watching for the flash of his white mug in the late morning sun. That stillness returned, but this time I noticed it more, because something had changed in me. It wasn't desire. Not yet. It wasn't an affair. It was a shift, a soft awakening. One evening, as dusk wrapped the street in lavender tones, I stood by the window with a cup of tea. I saw Adrian step outside, his hands tucked into his pockets, his hair still damp from a shower. He looked up. Our eyes met through the glass. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. We just stood there, two quiet people on opposite sides of a quiet road. And in that moment, I felt less alone than I had in weeks. People think distance in a marriage comes from a breaking point, a betrayal, a loud fight, but sometimes it arrives like a slow leak, so quiet you don't even notice it until everything inside you feels drained. Noah and I were still technically together, still functioning, still sharing space, but we had stopped reaching, stopped wondering, stopped asking if the other one was still there. And then someone else looked at me like I wasn't just passing through my life, and that look stayed with me. It was a Saturday morning, brighter than usual, the kind of light that made even the quietest corners of the house feel alive again. I stepped outside earlier than normal, wearing a pale linen dress that fluttered just below my knees. Not something I chose to impress anyone, just something that made me feel soft, light, a little more like myself. I bent down to pull a few stubborn weeds from the edge of the garden bed, and then, before I even heard him, I felt it. That sensation, the distinct awareness of being watched. Not in a threatening way, not inappropriately, but gently, attentively. I turned my head slightly. Adrian was standing by his porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he said quietly, without flourish, "Sorry, I didn't mean to stare. It's just, the view this morning is more beautiful than usual." I froze for a second, not out of offense, but surprise, because his words didn't feel like a pickup line. They weren't laced with desire. They carried something else, something rarer. Admiration without assumption. I smiled, keeping my voice light. "I think it's just the sunlight today." He paused. "Maybe, but I think it's you." And then he took a sip of his coffee, nodded politely, and walked back inside, leaving the moment right where it belonged. But I stayed there, crouched by the roses, my hands tangled in the roots, and my heartbeat suddenly unsteady. Because in that small exchange, I realized something. I had taken a step past the boundary I thought I was still standing behind, even though my feet hadn't moved at all. People often imagine emotional betrayal as some grand, reckless leap. But in truth, it's often more like this. A look that lingers too long. A sentence that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. That day, Adrian didn't touch me, didn't ask anything of me, but he reminded me without even trying that I was still capable of being seen. Not just watched, seen. It rained that afternoon. Not the dramatic kind, just a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the edges of everything and made the world feel a little more forgiving. I was in the backyard picking herbs for dinner, hands damp, hair curling from the moisture in the air, when I heard his voice, low and clear. "Would you like to come over and wait it out? I'm making ginger tea." I looked up. Adrian was standing on his porch under the awning, one hand cradling a steaming mug, the other casually tucked in his jacket pocket. His dark hair was already wet, beginning to cling to his forehead. He didn't insist. He offered, and I, cold, tired, and unexpectedly craving something human, nodded once and stepped across the fence. His porch was small, just wide enough for two people to sit side by side without touching, just close enough for the space between us to feel intimate without being dangerous. He handed me a warm ceramic mug. Ginger, honey, a hint of orange peel. I cupped it in both hands, not just for the heat, but for the comfort. We didn't talk much at first. The silence wasn't awkward. It was gentle, shared. Then he asked, "Do you always garden this time of day?" I nodded. "It keeps me busy. And when I'm busy, I don't feel quite so lonely." He didn't answer right away, but I didn't need him to. His stillness told me he understood more than he let on. As I handed him my empty cup for a refill, his fingers brushed mine, just briefly. Not a hold, not a reach, just a brush. A question. And though my hand pulled back, it didn't pull back quickly. We like to believe boundaries are bold, unshakable lines, but most of the time they're drawn in chalk, soft, uncertain, easy to smudge when no one's watching. That touch? It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't even intentional, but it lit something inside me. Not fire, just warmth, and it had been so long since I felt that. The rain softened into mist, painting everything in silvery shades of quiet. Adrian handed me the second cup of tea, his fingertips brushing mine again, but this time more slowly, as if he wasn't just offering warmth, but asking a question. He sat beside me, our shoulders close, but still untouched. The scent of ginger and wet earth lingered between us, and beneath that something unspoken. "I'm sorry," he said softly, not quite meeting my gaze. "I just needed to know if this feeling was real, or if I was imagining it." His voice didn't tremble, but it carried something raw, something people only share when they've grown tired of pretending not to feel. I didn't respond, not because I didn't know what to say, but because part of me was afraid of what I might admit if I opened my mouth. Instead, I looked down at my cup, watched the steam curl into the air like secrets slipping free. And in that stillness, I felt it again. The ache, the longing, not for drama, not for escape, but for softness, for presence, for someone to see me and not turn away. "Elise," he said gently. I looked up. He was watching me, really watching me, not with hunger, not with pity, but with the kind of attention that makes you feel like you matter simply because you're there. He leaned in slowly, so slowly I could have stopped it at any point, but I didn't. And when his lips touched mine, it wasn't fire, it wasn't heat, it was quiet, delicate, like a sigh after holding your breath for too long. Just one kiss, barely more than a moment, but enough to tell me that I was still alive inside my own body. Enough to remind me that I hadn't always felt like this, numb, folded into silence, invisible even in my own home. Some kisses are about desire, others are about memory, but the rarest ones, they're about recognition. That kiss didn't spark guilt, it sparked clarity. I stood up after that, not dramatically, no rushing, no breathless goodbye. Just a quiet thank you and a soft smile as I stepped back into the rain, the taste of ginger and something unnameable still on my lips. When I returned home, the house felt heavier, not because of anything that had happened, but because I had changed, even if only slightly. Noah was asleep, his plate from dinner still untouched in the sink. He didn't stir when I passed by, and for the first time I didn't feel sad about it. I felt honest, like I was no longer pretending I hadn't been fading for years. That night, sleep never came. I lay in bed beside a man I once shared everything with. Jokes, arguments, quiet Sunday mornings filled with coffee and playlists. Now we shared only the weight of what had been lost. Noah didn't stir. His breathing was slow, steady, familiar, but it didn't soothe me anymore. It reminded me of how far we had drifted. I turned toward the wall, not because I wanted to, but because I always did. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the rise of quiet thoughts, I reached for my phone. I didn't plan to write anything, but my fingers moved on their own almost involuntarily. I can't sleep. Just 3 words. No punctuation. No emoji. Just truth. I hovered over the send button for a few seconds longer than necessary. And then I let it go. I didn't expect a reply. It was past midnight, the kind of hour reserved for questions we don't ask out loud. But not a full minute later, my screen lit up. I know, 2 words, but they wrapped around me like a blanket. I sat up slowly, heart thudding in my chest. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from knowing that someone else, somewhere close, was also awake and waiting. I didn't change, didn't rehearse what I would say. I simply got out of bed, barefoot on cold wooden floors, and walked toward the door. The hallway was dark, but my steps felt guided, like I'd already taken them in my mind 100 times. When I opened the front door, Adrian was already there. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence spoke for him. I stepped aside. He stepped in, and I closed the door behind us. There are moments when nothing is said, but everything is understood. This wasn't a scene from a movie. There were no grand confessions, no thunder, no storm, no dramatic music. Just 2 people standing in the stillness of a house filled with unspoken needs. I didn't offer him a drink. He didn't ask for anything. But when my hand reached for his wrist, he followed. Not because I invited him with words, but because something between us already had. The house was still, silent in that strange, charged way when 2 people are about to cross an invisible line. Adrian stood in the entryway, unmoving, waiting, not assuming. His eyes didn't scan my body. They rested on my face with a softness that made my breath catch. I didn't offer small talk. I didn't ask why he came. I already knew. My hand, without thinking, reached for the buttons on my shirt. Slowly, not seductively, but deliberately, like someone choosing to be honest for the first time in years. He didn't touch me, didn't pull me in. He simply waited. And when the fabric slipped from my shoulders, he looked, not with hunger, but with reverence, as if he was seeing not just my body, but the years of quiet longing folded beneath my skin. His hand rested gently on my back, warm, steady, patient, and for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like I was giving myself away. I felt like I was returning to the part of me that had been buried beneath routines, muted beneath duty. Not Elise the wife, not Elise the woman who made dinner, who folded socks, who answered questions with empty smiles. Just Elise, alive, present, seen. We didn't rush into each other. We didn't crash like waves. We moved carefully, like 2 people reading each other's stories with their fingertips, each page turned with attention, each breath a punctuation mark. His lips touched the nape of my neck, and I trembled, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes when your body remembers it once belonged to joy, to intimacy, to touch that didn't ask for anything in return. We didn't speak, because in that moment, there was nothing left to explain. When I woke the next morning, the house was quiet, but it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet. It was the kind that echoes with truths you haven't yet spoken out loud. Adrian was gone. No note, no trace, just the faint scent of tea still lingering in the air. and the memory of his warmth still resting on my skin. And yet, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt clear, as if the night before hadn't been a mistake, but a moment of clarity dressed in silence. I pulled on my robe and stepped outside into the backyard. The lavender bushes shimmered with dew, the morning light painting everything in a soft glow. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about dinner plans, overdue bills, or my husband's unread messages. I was thinking about me, about the version of myself I had left behind somewhere along the way. The one who once loved late-night dancing in the kitchen. The one who used to cry during movies. The one who still believed tenderness could be real. That version hadn't disappeared. She had just gone quiet. And last night, she whispered again. We didn't sleep together, but something intimate had happened. Something more complicated than physical touch. We crossed a line, not with our bodies, but with our honesty. And sometimes that's the deeper betrayal, the one no one else can see, but that lives in the quiet spaces between your breaths. I didn't feel guilt, I felt awakened, because for the first time I wasn't thinking about what was expected of me. I was thinking about what I needed, what I had been missing, and whether staying silent was truly noble, or simply self-erasure. The morning light was softer than usual, as if the sky itself understood something delicate had unfolded during the night. I stood barefoot on the porch, my robe loosely tied, the air still damp from last night's rain. Inside, the house remained unchanged, quiet, clean, orderly. But I was not the same woman who had moved through it the day before. I stood there for a long time, watching nothing in particular, just breathing. And then the question came, uninvited but inevitable. What now? I didn't have the answer, but I knew I couldn't return to pretending. I had stepped outside the lines of my marriage, not in body, but in presence, in spirit. I hadn't betrayed Noah with lust. I had betrayed the silence we'd both been keeping alive, because I had wanted to feel, not adored, not rescued, just seen. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't scream. It doesn't come with lipstick on collars or unfamiliar scents. It comes when we stop showing up as ourselves, when we allow a part of us to starve quietly for years. And then one day, someone shows us what it's like to be nourished again, to be noticed, to be touched without being taken. Was it wrong? Maybe, but what felt even more wrong was realizing how long I had allowed myself to disappear. Later that morning, I passed Noah in the kitchen. He didn't ask where I'd been, didn't notice the distant look in my eyes, didn't see the woman standing in front of him was no longer reaching for connection, but for clarity. He poured his coffee. I stood at the window, and in that moment I realized something simple and terrifying. I don't want to be angry at him. I want to be honest with myself. This story is a work of narrative fiction inspired by real emotional experiences many people face in long-term relationships. It is not intended to promote or justify infidelity, but to explore the complexity of emotional disconnection, longing, and personal awakening. All names, characters, and events have been changed or fictionalized to respect privacy. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling in silence, you're not alone. Seek connection, seek truth, and above all, choose kindness, especially toward yourself.